Good afternoon, and welcome to our webinar on EPCRA TRI reporting. With this webinar, we are looking forward to sharing with you just some information about TRI reporting and specifically what is going to be new for your TRI reports that are due on July 1. Those of you that are counting, that is just 76 days away before your annual TRI reporting is due. Before we hop into the webinar, I just want to point out a couple of administrative tools for our webinar today. So you will see that there is a Q&A function on the Teams webinar platform. Please feel free to enter in a question at any time during the webinar. We will answer those questions at the end of the webinar, even if that extends us a little bit into overtime. Also, at the end of the webinar, you'll have my contact information if you would like to reach out for additional information or talk about any nuances relative to this topic. Also, you should be able to see the chat toolbar with the Teams webinar. We have uploaded a handout relative to this topic that should hopefully facilitate the topic, as well as a copy of the slides. If for some reason you don't have the functionality of seeing that chat and those files uploaded, we will be sending it out following the webinar along with a recording from today's webinar. So with those topics out of the little administrative tidbits out of the way, let's go ahead and hop into our content. So this webinar is being brought to you by HRP Associates. If you're not familiar with HRP, if this is the first HRP webinar you've attended, we've been around for over 40 years assisting our clients with a myriad of environmental, health and safety, sustainability, compliance solutions, environmental consulting solutions, and engineering solutions. Pertinent to our topic today, we have been working with an EPCRA throughout our duration of our company. So we'll be threading in that information relative today. Also, a little sneak peek of some of our content and the changes to anticipate for this year's report. We'll be talking about PFAS as well. And we have several subject matter experts in the realm of PFAS, whether it's identifying PFAS in your supply chain, identifying PFAS risk associated with environmental contamination or remediation, or balancing the myriad of regulations that are coming about relative to PFAS. Now, I'm Jackie Baxley, and I'll be leading us through the content today. I am the practice leader for our environmental health and safety and sustainability practice. And I have over 25 years of experience with these related subject matters, specifically with EPCRA reporting as well. So the first third of my career, I was in industry. I was the environmental engineer in a textile company and then a chemical company. So I was the one doing the EPCRA reporting, where the last 2/3 of my career, I've been helping our stakeholders with their EPCRA reporting. So our agenda for our webinar today is first we're going to give a high-level review and introduction of TRI reporting. If you're new to TRI reporting, then this first section will hopefully bring you up to speed with some of the key aspects of TRI reporting. We're also going to give a high-level introduction into PFAS, because as I mentioned a moment ago, not to bury the lead here, but that's kind of the key changes for 2024 reporting year is relative to PFAS. Then we're going to dive into those changes for the 2024 reporting year. And the 2024 reporting year is the report you're currently working on that is going to be due on July 1st. And then we're going to wrap it up with examples and best practices. And as indicated, you should be able to see within the chat function two handouts that we've uploaded to the chat. One of the handouts is an acronyms, definition, and helpful links handout. So what you'll see as we go through the webinar, you'll see some bolded and underlined phrases or words. That's where you'll find definitions or helpful links for additional information on those terms. Also, there's going to be a myriad of acronyms. It's just the world we live in for those of us that balance environmental health and safety compliance. So if any of the acronyms are new to you, then hopefully that handout will be a useful tool. Also, again, in the chat is a copy of all the slides that we're reviewing today. So let's go through the high-level introduction of EPCRA. So EPCRA has been around since the late 1960s, late 1980s. Passed on the heels of some of the other foundational compliance regulations that we live and work with today. And EPCRA was passed in response to concerns regarding environmental and public health and safety posed by handling and storage of toxic chemicals. The passing of EPCRA really arose from the Bhopal disaster, where a cloud of methyl isocyanate gas leaked from an industrial facility there and killed tens of thousands of people and related injuries. And so, in assessing that tragedy that happened, internationally, our regulators looked at, could that potentially happen here? Indeed, it could have. And so, to make our programs more robust, to where the public has an understanding of the chemicals that are stored and managed in their areas. Emergency responders know what those are. That really drove to the creation of EPCRA. And EPCRA has several sections. We're going to be focusing on just one section of EPCRA today, and that is section 313, which is the toxic release inventory section of EPCRA. Now, some of you might be familiar with some of these other sections of EPCRA. For example, you have probably only just recently recovered from the March 1st due date of the Tier 2 reports that are required under section 311, 312, as you're now working on your TRI reports that are due July 1. But we're going to be focusing on those TRI reports under section 313. And this covers a specific list of chemicals. We will be introducing you to that list of chemicals here in a moment. And the key requirement of the toxic release inventory reporting section of EPCRA is that you submit annual reports documenting how much toxic material entered into the environment as a result of your manufacturing, processing, or otherwise use activities on site. So TRI tracks the management of the specific list of toxic chemicals that may pose a threat to human health and the environment. So this is an annual report, and it annually reports how chemicals are released and managed within our communities. Again, it's due July 1 each year, so again, just 76 days away. And we report this information to the EPA. EPA reviews the information and then publishes this information. So it's important to note that what you publish in your TRI report is public information. And so anybody within our communities can click on our site on the TRI database that EPA publishes and see what chemicals we are reporting under the TRI report. Now, not everybody is subject to these TRI reports. A facility must hit all three of these criteria for them to have to submit a TRI. And the three thresholds are: first, the organization needs to be included in what's called a TRI covered North American Industrial Classification System code, or NAICS code. You might be more familiar with the acronym there. So if you're listening to this webinar and you work for a hospital is not in one of the covered NAICS codes. If you're on this webinar and you work for higher education, maybe you're with a college or a university, higher education is not in one of the subject NAICS codes. Maybe you work for an airport. An airport is also not in one of the covered NAICS codes. So what's in the covered NAICS codes are our traditional manufacturing operations. In the handout provided, there is a link to all the covered NAICS codes. So you can look at what your North American Industrial Classification System code is and see if you are subject, you meet the first criteria for reporting. The second criteria for reporting is that you have to have 10 or more full-time employees. So this is a definition that's in that acronym for what is defined as a full-time employee, but you have to have 10 or more full-time employees to be subject to this. And then the third threshold for reporting is going to be based off of your manufacturing process and otherwise use activities associated with these chemicals. So again, you have to meet all three of these criteria to be subject to reporting. So let's dive into the manufacture, process, and otherwise use activity thresholds here, because that's where it becomes a little bit more technical. So the thresholds, there has to be thresholds met relative to these activities of manufacture, process, or otherwise use. Those activities are defined in your handout. So if you are manufacturing, processing, or otherwise using a TRI listed chemical in a quantity at or above the thresholds in a given year, then you've met that criteria. Now, what the thresholds are kind of depend on the activity and to a certain extent depend on the listed TRI chemical. So, in general terms, otherwise use has a threshold of 10,000 pounds, where manufacture or process has a threshold of 25,000 pounds. Now, there are certain TRI listed chemicals that are identified as chemicals of special concern, and they have much lower thresholds, some as low as zero point 0.1 pound, some as high as 100 pounds, but they have much lower thresholds for these chemicals of special concern. Now, the list of TRI chemicals, so what chemicals are we talking about relative to these activities? So there is a list of TRI chemicals, and you can either find that in the regulations, specifically 40 CFR Part 372.65, or a tool that a lot of environmental professionals like to use is called the list of lists. And the list of lists will also list out these TRI chemicals. So whichever mechanism you prefer, whether you prefer to dig into the regulations or you prefer to use the list of lists, you'll see here a snapshot of each of those. So on the left-hand side, that's just a snapshot from the regulations, where you'll see it's listed by chemical name. You're provided a CAS number, and then there's an effective date. That is important because of the myriad of PFAS chemicals that have been added over the last few years. Some of them are added, but it's not effective until a certain date, and that means that's when you need to consider it for your reporting purposes. The list of lists, again, is a tool that a lot of environmental professionals like to use. Similarly, it lists by chemical name. It provides the CAS number for the chemical, and then if you look over, there is a column called EPCRA 313 TRI. So if there's an indication in that column, then it is telling you it is subject to this TRI reporting. So as you are looking at your activities and you are looking at that list of toxic chemicals, what you're going to do is you're going to identify how much do you manufacture, how much do you process, how much do you otherwise use of each of those chemicals, and then compare them to the respective threshold. Now, there is a de minimis exemption concentration for these toxic chemicals. So in general terms, if you have one of these toxic chemicals in a mixture less than 1%, you don't have to consider it in your threshold determination unless it's a carcinogen, and then that threshold de minimis concentration reduces to 0.1%. So if it's a carcinogen and it's in a specific listed toxic chemical is in a mixture less than 0.1%, then you don't have to consider it. Now, it's important to note that this de minimis exemption does not apply to that special category that we call chemicals of special concern. There is no de minimis exemption. So if there is a chemical of special concern in a mixture at 0.002%, then you're calculating that toward your thresholds. And so this just brings up the point that you do need to account for these TRI chemicals that you might have in mixtures or solutions when you're determining your threshold. I have an example of that on the very next slide. And with respect to activities involving these toxic chemicals at your facility, when you have more than one threshold activity category, then you need to report if you exceed any activity category. So, what that means is maybe you're using a particular TRI listed chemical, and in some applications it's being manufactured, in some applications it's being processed, and in some applications it's being otherwise used. If you trigger any one of those thresholds, then all of those manufacturer process otherwise used is going to end up getting reported in your TRI report. So one way to look at this is if one is in, then it's all in. So just a quick example for how would you take into consideration a TRI listed chemical in a mixture or solution? Let's just say, for example, at your facility, let's say that you are an industry where you take resin pellets, you melt those pellets, and you extrude them into specialty molded parts. In reviewing the supplier information on the resin, you identify that that resin contains styrene, which, if you look at whether you prefer looking at the regulations or you prefer looking at the list of lists, you will see that styrene is a TRI listed chemical. And the information that you have is that styrene is in this resin pellet in the amount of 1 to 5%. Now, EPA guidance is, if you know the range, so for example, here we know it's 1 to 5%, EPA recommends you use the midpoint of the range for your threshold determination. So the midpoint between 1 and 5 is going to be 3. So we're going to calculate 3% styrene relative to this mixture. So if you're looking at your production records, you identify that in 2024, the facility processed 132,856 pounds of this specific resin pellet. So if we multiply that by 3% of styrene, then we have just shy of 4,000 pounds of styrene that is going to be added to all other process of the styrene. If we add up all of that styrene that's being processed in our facility and it ends up being 25,000 pounds or more, then we have met that requirement for styrene. We've met that threshold for styrene, and we will be reporting styrene on our TRI reports. So once you've identified, yes, I do have to do a report. You're in one of those covered industries, you have at least 10 full-time employees, and you've done those calculations of manufacture, process, and otherwise use, and you've exceeded the threshold, then you're going to have to do a TRI report. And again, that report is due on July the 1st. You're going to report these TRI reports through what's called the EPA Central Data Exchange. It's a platform in the Central Data Exchange called Try Me, which is TRI Made Easy, is what that acronym actually stands for. And within that Try Me platform, you're going to be reporting on what we either call a Form R or Form A. It's not uncommon for people to call these TRI reports Form R reports because that's the most common form that is used for the reporting. A Form A is a streamlined report that is available for certain chemicals that have minimal releases associated with it. But whether you're doing the Form R or Form A, what you're actually reporting on there is what is released to the environment as a result of your manufacturing process or otherwise use. So based off of how your manufacturing process or otherwise using these TRI chemicals, how much is released to the air? How much is released through disposal mechanisms, whether it's recycling, whether it's waste disposal or other, and how much is released to the water, whether that's through stormwater or wastewater. Maybe it's going to a sanitary sewer district. Maybe you have your own wastewater treatment system on site. This is what you're reporting. You're reporting the releases to the environment on those TRI reports. Now, there are some other considerations to take into account. Remember, this is kind of a high-level introduction to TRI reporting before we get into the changes. So those of you that are newer to TRI reporting, just be aware that, just like any environmental reg out there, there are exemptions. And the most common exemption for TRI reporting is what we call the article exemption. And so in your handout, we have defined article. So you know what we mean by article exemption. An article is, in short, an article is one that has been shaped or formed to a specific size. That specific shape or size is integral to its function, and as a result of its use, it does not release any of the toxic substances. So, if you could potentially meet an article exemption relative to the TRI reporting, and therefore don't have to report. But in that handout, If that's a new concept to you, we have the definition of article. We also have a helpful link for detailed information on that article exemption. And there's a handful of other exemptions as well, but it's that article exemption that I find most folks are reviewing. And then lastly, as we wrap up this introduction to TRI reporting, is record keeping. Any of you that have been environmental or health or safety professionals for a while know that in the world of compliance, you are guilty until you prove your innocence, and you prove your innocence with record keeping. And so this rule is no different. So relative to record keeping, you want to maintain records for at least 3 years, realizing that maybe your corporate governance structure might require longer time periods. But from a regulatory perspective, at least maintain for 3 years all supporting materials and documentation used to make the reporting applicability determination. So that's going to be supplier notifications, production records, whatever you consult relative in your determination process. A copy of each TRI report that is actually submitted. So you're going to download a copy of that report from that CDX platform, save that to your files, and then documenting supporting the report submitted. So again, that's all that information that goes into account for the information that you present in that TRI report. All right. So with that high level introduction to TRI reporting, let's do a high level introduction to PFAS, because as I mentioned earlier, that is the key change for your reports this year is a pesky little thing we call PFAS. So if PFAS are new to you, PFAS is a group or chemical family of substances. These are what we call per and polyfluoral alkyl substances. So it's a grouping of chemicals. And these chemicals have properties that manufacturing knows and loves: oil resistant, water resistant, temperature resistant, chemical resistant, fire resistant, electrically insulating. So they have properties that are highly sought after relative to many different types of manufacturing processes. However, they come with a pretty bad side effect, if you will, and that is that PFAS are what we call forever chemicals. They do not break down easily. They bioaccumulate in the blood and in the food chain. They've been found in every continent. They've been found on the top of Mount Everest. They've been found in wildlife across the globe, whether that's through air deposits or sloughing off of camping materials or what have you. But it does kind of bioaccumulate in our blood. It's persistent in the environment, and it is associated with several health effects and concerns, which is why not only EPA, but a lot of state agencies have really been focusing their attention on PFAS, I would say, in the last 10 years or so. So again, PFAS, it's a family of chemicals. And depending on what definition of PFAS you're referring to, it is thousands of chemicals that are in this category of PFAS. Now, their typical uses over the years have been within firefighting foams. You might be aware of what's called AFFF foam. That is a PFAS firefighting foam. It's been used in metal plating and finishing. It's been used in textiles. It's been used as a coating in paper and cardboard products. It's been used in personal, household, and industrial cleaners, and as well as products like shampoos and soaps. It's been used in surface coating. It's common in plastics and resins and rubbers and so much more. So, in the handout, and I saw some chatter there. So, those of you that were wondering where the handout is, you should see it in the chat function itself. We put it in the chat right before the session got started, so you should be able to see those in the chat function. But in that handout, we do have a link to some information on PFAS if this is still something that's new to you, emerging relative to your knowledge, and you need additional information. We have some helpful links in helping you understand not only what are PFAS, but where are they commonly used. All right, so now let's dig into the changes and the recommendations as you are embarking on the TRI reports that are coming due in just 76 days. So, what has changed? So, EPA has been adding PFAS chemicals to that TRI list since 2019. So, remember we said you can access that TRI list of toxic chemicals either by linking in directly to the regulations or consulting that list of lists. And each year, new PFAS chemicals have been added to that list since 2019. But most recently, EPA designated PFAS as a chemical of special concern. And if you remember during that introduction, those chemicals of special concern are not subject to that de minimis exemption. So it doesn't matter how much of a listed PFAS is in a material that you're manufacturing, processing, or otherwise using. If one of those listed PFAS chemicals is in there in any amount, we have to account for it relative to our threshold determination for TRI reporting. Um, with this change of adding it as a chemical of special concern, it also removes some of the streamlined reporting elements potentially available to other TRI chemicals. Specifically, you can't use that streamlined form, which is called a Form A. You must use the Form R, which is the full form. And when you are filling out that Form R, you can't report in ranges. You can't report in a range like zero point 0.1 to 100. You have to report specific numbers. And this change is in effect. It is in effect right now for the 2024 reporting year. What that means is, as you are preparing your reports that are due this July for last year's activities, you need to be able to identify any amount of these listed PFAS within those products you're manufacturing, processing, or otherwise using. All right, so we look back at who is subject to TRI reporting. Remember, first you have to meet all three of these top boxes. You have to first be within one of those covered industries based off of your NAICS code. You have to have at least 10 or more full-time employees, and you have to meet those thresholds that process manufacturing otherwise using. So relative to PFAS, there is going to be no de minimis exemption as you're calculating your threshold. So what that means is you need to know any amount of these listed PFAS in those materials. Also, the threshold for the chemicals of special concern, remember, are much less. If it was not a chemical of special concern, remember our thresholds would be 10,000 pounds for otherwise use, 25,000 pounds for manufacture or process. But with these PFAS, the threshold is 100 pounds. So if you manufacture 100 pounds of one of these listed PFAS, you're reporting. If you process 100 pounds of one of these listed PFAS, you're reporting. Or if you otherwise use 100 pounds of one of these listed PFAS, you are reporting. And so for the specific list of PFAS, I do find that the list of lists is a little bit more difficult to use relative to these listed PFAS. I like to use the regulations specifically when I'm talking about these PFAS. So in that handout that is in the chat, there is a helpful link straight to 40 CFR Part 372.65. And if you scroll through that list that you're going to see in Part 372.65, scroll down to paragraph D. And in paragraph D, you're going to see Table 4. And Table 4 is all of those TRI listed PFAS, as well as their respective effective date. So if there is a PFAS that is listed in there and the effective date is 2021, what that meant is for the 2021 report year, and then every year thereafter, it's subject. If it says 2024, then that means starting, the 2024 reporting year, it is subject. And that's the reporting year we're in right now, is the 2024 reporting year. And then also, if we do meet these thresholds, if we meet that 100-pound threshold for any of these listed PFAS chemicals, then when we do the actual report, the actual TRI report, We are going to be using that Form R. We are not going to be able to be allowed to use that streamlined Form A. And remember, we're not going to be able to report in ranges. We're going to have to report specific numbers within that Form R. So, a word about notification requirements from your suppliers. So, how are you going to know what products you're manufacturing, processing, or otherwise using that have PFAS in them? Well, if you are sourcing materials and products, those suppliers must notify you with the first shipment of each year relative to if those products contain a TRI chemical. So this is what we call readily available data. This is the information your suppliers are providing you, noting that your suppliers are supposed to be sending you the those supplier notifications with the first shipment of each year. And the supplier notifications, very rarely are they so on the nose that it is saying, here is your supplier notification relative to TRI reporting. It's typically just included maybe in a safety data sheet, in a letter, or some other type of literature that you may be receiving. So maybe it gets to the right person, maybe it gets to you or the environmental department relative to this. Maybe it doesn't, but we need to make sure that you are able to access that reliable data, maintain that reliable data, and then use that reliable data relative to these reports. Now, there are challenges with these supplier notifications relative to PFAS, and we could chit chat all day about our experiences relative to these supplier notifications and challenges and realities. And I think we can kind of boil it down to a few key points, which is readily available information is lacking still for PFAS. PFAS is what we call an emerging contaminant. So the regulations are emerging, so our knowledge about it is emerging. And and a lot of the suppliers that we talk to on behalf of our clients, we are still seeing, these rules first came out in 2019 relative to this report. And so here we are 6 years later, and we are still talking to suppliers that have not gotten a handle on if they have PFAS in their supply chains or not. Another challenge is that PFAS information is not required on safety data sheets. And it's not required on safety data sheets because safety data sheets are an OSHA document, and PFAS are still not regulated by OSHA. So OSHA has not kept up or has not caught up yet with this emerging contaminant and its concern. A couple of years ago, I had the opportunity to talk to some people at NIOSH that were just starting their assessment on PFAS. And so OSHA has just not caught up yet with this emerging hazard. And so it's not recognized yet as an OSHA hazardous chemical. You're not going to see it in, you might, but it's not required to be indicated in that section 3 of the hazardous ingredients information. Section 15, which is the other regulatory information section of a safety data sheet, is not required information on a safety data sheet, so it's not always complete. So just the fact that it's not required on a safety data sheet, it's not required on OSHA labeling, just causes a challenge relative to that readily available information that we might have at our fingertips. There's no uniformity of information provided in product literature. So many different organizations define PFAS differently. That's probably why we don't really see that universal information relative to product literature. Environmental data sheets are great. They are the environmental equivalent of a safety data sheet, but they're not widely available. They're not widely used. They're not required. So some suppliers will have environmental data sheets, and that's a lot more reliable relative to these environmental rules, but they're not widely used yet in the industry. And then honestly, just the supply chain knowledge is lacking. We have complex supply chains. And with those supply chain complexities, you might be receiving a product from a supplier, and that supplier is maybe relabeling it or rebranding it from their supplier, and that their supplier might be relabeling it and rebranding it. So your supplier could be, 5 points removed from the actual manufacturer of the product, thus causing those complexities of that knowledge being relayed to the eventual user of the material. So our recommendation: if you don't have your most recent supplier notifications, reach out to your suppliers as soon as possible. You have 76 days until this report is due. So reach out to your suppliers right away. What we like to do is to be very specific with our requests when we reach out to suppliers and say, hey, we're assessing our TRI reporting. Here is the list of specific PFAS chemicals that are now included. Can you please provide us with a certification letter or some type of attestation that your product does or does not contain these materials? And if they are in there, just remember you need to know the percentage, regardless of how much is in there, because there's no de minimis exemption. Focus on the materials that may have PFAS due to those desirable products or properties of PFAS. I know, depending depending on the particular individual sitting in our audience right now, some of you could have literally hundreds, if not thousands, of products relative to your TRI assessment that you look at relative to manufacturer, process, and otherwise use. So timing just does not allow for you in the next 76 days to look at hundreds or thousands of products, right? So focus on those that have the properties that are associated with PFAS. We have a couple of references for you coming up if you're not as familiar with what those properties are. And then repeat the process each year. And the reason why we say repeat it each year is because, remember, an emerging contaminant, we have emerging knowledge about these. You literally could have somebody in your supply chain right now that right now, as of today, has no knowledge of one of these listed PFAS in their product. But as we become more knowledgeable, next year that same supplier might be like, oh, wait, now we do have knowledge. And they might be updating those supplier notifications. So you're just going to have to stay on the ball with always making sure that you have the most recent supplier notification. And remember, suppliers are obligated to send that to you with the first shipment of the material each year. Now, also realize there's a myriad of PFAS regulations out there. Some at the local level, some at the state level, some at the federal level. So we're talking very specifically about TRI reporting right now, but realize your customers might be asking very similar information of you. Maybe not because of TRI reporting, but because of this patchwork of other regulations about, PFAS in packaging or PFAS in consumer products or PFAS in this or PFAS in that. So TRI is a very specific list. I think we're up to about 182, give or take, specific PFAS chemicals listed in that TRI list of chemicals. But depending on what regulation you're consulting, there are literally thousands of PFAS out there. So realize that this activity we're talking about now, you'll have a narrow focus relative to TRI because it's only, it's about 200, give or take, we'll round chemicals. But depending on the other regulation you might be navigating, it could be a much more extensive list of what's considered PFAS. And then other information that's just going to be handy to have on file, have at your fingertips as you're preparing these TRI reports, whether it's because of a PFAS or not, is to have manufacturing, processing, or otherwise use information that supports the fate and transport of that specific TRI listed chemical in your product. You might be using a TRI chemical in a way that it's bound up in the final product, and it's going to be very minimal releases to the environment. So if you're able to say, 90% of this is going to be in the finished product and it's not going to be released to the air, waste, or water from our facility, then when you're calculating those releases, realize that they're going to be, relatively small based off of the original threshold that kicks you into the report. Also, helpful information is having air emissions data, whether it's from an air permit or an air permit evaluation, knowing how much of these TRI chemicals are emitted to the air. Shipping papers is going to be helpful, especially if the way the TRI chemical is being manufactured, processed, or otherwise used at the facility. If some of it ends up in your waste, that's going to help you in calculating the release via disposal. Similarly, waste determination profiles or waste sampling results are going to be helpful relative to that release determination. Recycling, similarly, will help with that particular release scenario. If you are disposing of one of these TRI chemicals through recycling or waste disposal, one of the required elements is going to be the EPA ID number of those recycling or receiving facilities. So having that paperwork is going to be helpful. And then lastly, if the way it's being manufactured, processed, or otherwise used results in a release to the water, then wastewater sampling results or reports, stormwater sampling results or reports could be helpful as well. All right, so let's, with the time that we have left, I wanted to go through a couple of examples and some best practices, and then we'll. I've seen some chatter. I'll dig into the questions that are popping up. Even if we go into a little bit of overtime, we'll make sure that we address any of the questions that come up. All right, so some examples and best practices. Example one. So I've already given you some cautions in safety data sheets. So this first example, the theme is how reliable are safety data sheets relative to TRI reporting. So in our example here, we are evaluating TRI reporting applicability at our facility. As we're going through this process, we review a product that is used as a defoamer to see if it has any information, see if we have any information available relative to PFAS. Just defoaming is one of those uses, one of those properties that PFAS is known for. So if you are using defoamers, anti-foamers, I would star those products relative to your PFAS evaluation. So in this example, the only readily available information we currently have at our fingertips is a safety data sheet for this defoamer, and the safety data sheet is dated 2018. So as we're looking at the safety data sheet, we go to section 15, which is regulatory information. Remember, section 15 is not a required component of a safety data sheet. It's one of the optional components of a safety data sheet per OSHA. But in this particular safety data sheet, we look at section 15, and specifically, you'll see it says SARA 313. SARA is, you will sometimes see EPCRA referred to as SARA. Not to get too much in the weeds there, but SARA was an amendment to a particular regulation. So EPCRA and SARA you will see used interchangeably. But where you see SARA 313, that is EPCRA 313. That is this program we are talking about, and we see no listed substances noted there. Now, as I look at section 3, and you should always look at section 3 relative to TRI reporting if you're using a safety data sheet. When I look at section 3, which is the composition and ingredient information, there is no detail on any of the components. It just says there are no hazardous ingredients here. Now remember, OSHA has not yet regulated PFAS. So if there was PFAS in this product, they would not be obligated to put it here because it's currently not subject to OSHA yet. If you were to look up PFAS under OSHA, you're going to see personal fall arrest systems, not this family of chemicals. So should you rely on this safety data sheet? No. You should use caution in relying on this particular safety data sheet, as first of all, it predates these PFAS rules that we've talked about. So remember, it was 2019 that the rules first changed relative to TRI reporting that started adding these PFAS chemicals. So the fact that we indicated that this safety data sheet was dated 2018, it's older than the reg change. So because of that alone, you should not rely where it says EPCRA 313 or SARA 313 none, you should not rely on it because it predates this change. So secondly, PFAS are still not regulated by OSHA. So therefore, the safety data sheet is not obligated to include PFAS in the ingredient section in section 3. Now, if we were to look at section 3, and if there were to have been a list of ingredients there and the percentages added up to at least 100%, then I would have some degree in confidence to where I could look up each one of those ingredients individually and see if they were TRI listed or not. But in this particular example, there was just no information on that ingredient list. So I don't know if there's a PFAS material that is hiding in this product or not. So what I would do if I'm going through the evaluation and it was a product that, is a potential carrier of a PFAS because of its properties, I would go to my supplier. I would ask for a current supplier notification because remember, they're required to provide that to you with the first shipment of each year. And ask that from your vendor. Taking it up a notch, you could say, here's the list of PFAS I'm concerned about. Does this product have any of these? And get that information from your supplier. All right, in example 2, our scenario here are hidden PFAS. So let's say at your facility, you apply a fabric protector to your product. Your safety data sheet is current. Let's just say it's dated 2024, 2025. So the safety data sheet is current. But when you look at section 15, it's mute relative to EPCRA 313. So you see, we just have a snapshot here. Tells us about EPCRA 311, 312. Those are the tier 2 reports, if you're familiar with tier 2 reporting. Talks about TSCA. But I'm not seeing anything here relative to SARA 313 or EPCA 313. But as I just read through here, I do see what I call an indicator word. And hold tight here in a second. I'm going to give you a list of some indicator words or phrases that should pique your spidey senses relative to PFAS. And here I see fluorochemical. When you see the word fluoro, you should always kind of pique your PFAS senses relative to the material. So here I see that there is a fluorochemical urethane in here. I don't know the specifics of it yet. So let's go to section 3 and see what section 3 has to share with us. So in this safety data sheet, I go to section 3, which is where all those ingredients are. And I'm happy to see in this example, if I was to add up all of those percentage by weights, I end up actually with a little bit more than 100%. So with that, I'm not worried about there being an extra component that is not indicated here. So when you have a section 3 that adds up to 100%, give or take, then you can have a higher degree of confidence maybe in the safety data sheet because you can then look up each one of these ingredients. So if I look up acetone in my TRI list, I'm not going to see acetone as a 313 listed chemical. I'm going to see isopropyl alcohol in there, but I want you to know next to isopropyl alcohol, you're going to see that it's only listed if you are manufacturing isopropyl alcohol via a strong acid process. If you're not manufacturing isopropyl alcohol relative to the strong acid process, then this line item is not subject to you. I can look up light, alkylate, petroleum, naphtha. It's not going to be listed as 313. I can look up carbon dioxide. It's not going to be listed 313. But how am I going to look up this fluorochemical urethane? Because it's noted as a trade secret. So I don't know the specific chemical I'm looking for. So what would you do in this particular situation? So there are some provisions for trade secrets in EPCRA. If you go back to the very beginning of the presentation when I was introducing some of the key sections of EPCRA, there is a section on trade secrets. And there are provisions in a Form R about whether what you are reporting is a trade secret, but you do still need some information from your supplier, recognizing you might have to sign some confidentiality agreements or NDAs to get the information. But if you're looking at a safety data sheet like this, I would call the manufacturer. If you were to look at this complete safety data sheet, you would see that on a lot of sections on this safety data sheet, it says call the supplier, or not call the supplier, the actual manufacturer, and it has the manufacturer's name and it has their phone number. So if this is your product and you're assessing, I would call the manufacturer as listed on that safety data sheet and say, hey, I'm assessing for TRI reporting. I see you have a fluorochemical in here. Can you tell me, is it one of these listed products or not? And then, working with them and understanding the degree of their trade secret, and if it's covered under EPCRA, then when you're doing the Form R, you might be indicating some of those sanitized sections of the TRI. So some of those indicator words that I promised you I'd tell you. So properties and uses. So how products are used. These are some indicators that should pique your PFAS senses. So words like nonstick, water repellent or water resistant, stain repellent or stain resistant, grease or oil repellent or resistant, surfactants, heat resistant, firefighting foams. For a complete or not a complete list, but for a pretty comprehensive list, ITRC has a great guidance document on PFAS. Specifically, there is a chapter in their guidance documents on current and historical known uses and products of PFAS. So that could help you in narrowing down relative to your specific industrial operations. That is a link that is provided in that handout that was provided in the chat. And then names that should pique your PFAS senses are chemical names that include fluoro, perfluoro, or fluoropolymers. Those should all be ones that you dig into as well. So just a couple things just to be aware of as you're trying to assess if a product has PFAS or not. So, some final recommendations relative to this new rule change with TRI reporting. And as you're looking toward your July 1 report, use caution with safety data sheets as reliable information. Use caution when using a safety data sheet as quote unquote reliable information under TRI reporting. It may or may not be. Again, the tool that I always like to use is looking at section 3, and if section 3 adds up to 100% or more of all the ingredients, then you can look up each of those ingredients as opposed to relying on that section 15. Document your outreach to your suppliers relative to attempting to obtain that more recent, relevant, and reliable information. And so what I mean by that, what internally, when we're doing this on behalf of a client, we attempt three times to reach out to a supplier. Maybe first we reach out via email. If we don't get any type of response, we follow up with a phone call. And if we don't get any response, maybe we see if there's a web page where we can reach out. If there's not a web page we can reach out, then maybe we go back to the original attempt of an email, and we document all of those. And we document that either we didn't get anything or we document what we did get. And that way you can show your due diligence, because jumping down to that last bullet, recognize that as more information becomes available regarding PFAS in our supply chain, we very well could find ourselves in a situation where we did our due diligence with previous TRI reports and we never identified that PFAS was in what we manufacture, process, otherwise use. But now, as our knowledge has increased, now all of a sudden we have information from a supplier where PFAS is involved. When we have new information like that, EPA does allow you to revise historical reports, and you would need to go back and revise historical reports as you get that new information. But what EPA does not recognize is failing to do your due diligence and just not identifying it. And that would not be considered a revised report. That would be considered a failure to report. So documenting your due diligence. So if you do ever identify PFAS that you did not originally identify, you can go back and revise a report as opposed to finding yourself in a situation where you failed to report. And then document applicability as well as inapplicability with TRI reporting. Sometimes it's just as important to document that you're not subject to a rule as it is to document you are subject to a rule. All right, so I'm about to dig into the questions that have been popping up. Before I do that, I'm gonna land on this page as I am looking at your and responding to your questions. We do have a couple of other webinars coming up. In May, we have a webinar on EPA's relatively new restrictions on methylene chloride, perchloroethylene, and trichloroethylene, and what that might mean to your operations. So methylene chloride, PCE, and TCE are either going to be completely banned or phased out and or restricted. So if you are using those within your processes, this is definitely a not miss webinar for you. In July, we will be bringing you an update on the OSHA heat standard. So that standard was originally published in 2024. It continues to go through the process. There is a public comment period that is coming to an end here soon. So whether there's actually movement on the rule or not, we will bring you an update on what that standard is, as well as some best practices as you're dealing with the heat within your operations. We have an in-person training in June on hazardous waste and DOT training. So if you're in the Greenville, South Carolina area, you can take advantage of that in-person training. And we have online training that's available all the time at your convenience. So the QR code or going to hrpassociates.com/training will get you to all of this information. All right, so with that, let's see these questions that have been coming through. So we have one, just somebody expressing surprise that OSHA isn't jumping on the PFAS bandwagon. It's just things work slowly. Like I said, it's a couple of years ago, maybe it was 3 years ago. I had the opportunity to bump into somebody at NIOSH that is actually looking at this, and there's a series of studies and research and things that have to go on for OSHA to identify that it is a hazardous, it is hazardous on human health, in the workforce. And so they're just going through their process. And it's just a slow process. So let's see. We have a question here. Why wouldn't you use a certified letter? I'm not sure what that's referring to. A certified letter would be great if you can get a letter of certification from a supplier that your product does not contain PFAS. That's great. My follow-up question would be is what are they defining as PFAS? Because again, there's multiple definitions of PFAS out there. But if you have a letter of certification from your supplier about the presence or absence of PFAS, absolutely that is critical documentation you want to keep on hand. So asking here for clarification on the Section 3, 100%. So what I'm just sliding back here. So Section 3 of a safety data sheet tells you the composition information on the ingredients. So in this particular example, if I add up all of these, using the higher end of these ranges, this adds up, I think, about 106 or give or take. So the fact that this is 100% or more, then that tells me that there's a low likelihood for there to be an additional product in here hiding that is not disclosed. Now, if let's just say I'm looking at the safety data sheet, and let's just say all it gives me is acetone at 37 to 41%, and that's the only information that's listed in this ingredient in this composition group, then that's like 60% of other stuff in there that I have no idea what it is. And if it's a product that has properties that are known to PFAS, then I'm going to be concerned that that other 60% could be some percentage of a listed PFAS. And knowing that a safety data sheet is an OSHA document, and knowing that OSHA has not yet, identified PFAS as a hazardous component, I would use extreme caution in a safety data sheet where I don't know the full ingredient composition and I have reason to suspect that there's PFAS in it. All right, let's see. I think I'm caught up on the chat. Let me look at the Q&A function here. Oh, looks like we don't have any that have been entered in via the Q&A, but I do believe I've addressed all the ones in the chat. Let me just, oh, here we go. I did miss one. Can you explain the difference between chemical of special concern and the 100 reportable amount? Not, yeah. So the difference there is chemical of special concern is a whole group of or a collection of different products. So PFAS is just one of the groups that is considered a chemical of special concern. There are also others that you'll see in there, like mercury is a chemical of special concern, lead is a chemical of special concern. What we call persistent bioaccumulative toxins are chemicals of special concern. So, chemicals of special concern, what that means is they are TRI listed chemicals for which there is no de minimis exemption, and the reporting threshold is going to be significantly less than the 10,000 pound otherwise used or the 25,000 pound manufacturer or otherwise use. What its threshold is going to be defined in the regs. So within the regs, under the chemicals of special concern, it will tell you for each chemical of special concern what their threshold is. And that threshold, you're only going to see one number. That is the threshold, regardless of whether it's manufactured, processed, or otherwise used. So if you look at PFAS in that table of chemicals of special concern, you will see that PFAS has a threshold of 100 pounds. And so what that means, so PFAS is a chemical of special concern. PFAS is specifically has a threshold of 100 pounds. So it is a 100-pound threshold for each listed PFAS chemical relative to manufacture, relative to process, relative to otherwise use. All right, I think I am caught up on the chat. I don't see any additional ones coming in on the questions. So thank y'all very much for your time and attention and your questions and interaction today. Feel free to reach out to us at any moment in time as you digest this information and you prepare for those TRI reports or any other pesky PFAS regulation that is impacting your organization. You see my email and my direct extension listed there. Also, HRP has a lot of advocacy and outreach opportunities. We try to highlight with our community changes in regulations, information that might help you in your day to day activities, whether it's PFAS related or it's just environmental compliance, health and safety compliance, sustainability, risk assessments. Follow us on your favorite platform to stay in touch with all of the environmental, health and safety, and engineering applications that might interest you. And with that, I will say let's call it a day. And thank you for your time and attention.